Should I move to Boise or Moscow? Dive in with me today as we discover some of the hidden gems and potential deal breakers in each city. And by the end of this video, you'll know exactly where your next home should be if you're between these two cities. Hey, my name is Craig Flood, and I am your guide to relocating to Idaho. And in today's video, we're going to be comparing what it would be like to live in Moscow, Idaho, or Boise, Idaho. So in this video, we're gonna dive into kind of the heartbeats of each town. They're very different even though they're in the same state. And then we're gonna jet off to the airports. If you're a frequent flyer, one of these cities is probably gonna become your new best friend and could be a deal breaker for the other. And we're also gonna talk about the landscape because they're very different. Moscow is very unique. And we'll also talk about the weather, again, very different, even in summers and winters. And be sure to stick around till the end because I'm saving the best two for last, which I think are the most dividing when you're thinking about what city you might want to end up in. So let's just compare the towns. Moscow is a small town and Boise is a big town. Moscow is isolated. It is that biggest town in that area. There's nothing else much around it. It just gets smaller as you go. Granted, you do have Pullman across the border, but that's just another small town right next to a small town. If you compare that to Boise, Boise is a very large city, and then you have all these other large cities next to it. So you have the whole Treasure Valley. So you have Meridian, Eagle, Kuna, Caldwell, Nampa, all these other places. And it's kind of like one. Whenever somebody is talking to me or thinking about two different cities like this, I always tell them it's not that you're just getting Boise, you're getting the Treasure Valley. And there's a lot going on here. It is the largest metropolitan area in Idaho. And so a lot of things come with that. But in Moscow, it is classic small town. You have one kind of downtown strip. It's a few blocks and that's it. And then from there, it just kind of peels off into homes, and very quickly you're into kind of farm roads and large fields. And this also affects what work opportunities might be like. I was just talking with somebody recently who is between the two cities, considering both of them. He's unique in the sense that he is going to work for the university. So speaking of universities, there is a university in Moscow, Idaho, and a university in Boise, Idaho. In Moscow, you do notice it a bit, like they do take up a bunch of real estate, and just like they do in Boise. But along with being an educational opportunity for your kids, if you have a family and they want to grow up and go to school locally, it's also a big employment opportunity. And so for the gentleman I was just recently talking to, he could really go to either, and he's kind of set because he works at the university. Now, speaking of the university, obviously when school's in session, the population does go up, and you do see an impact from that in terms of traffic, people walking around town. Just this morning in Boise, I was driving down to work, and there were like 100 people running up this hill onto the bench. And I'm just thinking, oh, that must be the university kids because school's back in session now. But in terms of population, what it feels like, again, Boise is a large town. You compare that to Moscow, Moscow is just not, they're just not in the same ballpark. In terms of traffic, it's almost non-existent. In Moscow, you just aren't going to experience it. There's probably not much of a commute, obviously, depending on what you do for work. Maybe you commute over to Pullman, and maybe there's a little traffic at the first light as you come into Pullman. But other than that, it's classic small town, not a lot of traffic. You get to know people really easily. You see them around at Rosar's, the grocery store, or the hardware store, or you see them at a local coffee shop. Whereas Boise and the Treasure Valley, you kind of blend in more. Maybe you run into people, maybe you don't. But then depending on where you're moving from, Boise might feel like a really small town for you too. And so I'm curious to know what your thoughts are. If you had to choose between Boise or Moscow, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment down below and say, hey, why you'd choose one and why you'd choose it over the other. And if you're considering relocating here to Idaho, I get calls, texts, and emails every day from people just like you looking to do that. And my team would love to be your guide as you make that transition. And also, I see some of you out there, you haven't subscribed to my YouTube channel yet. And if you're interested in all things Idaho, what it's like to live, work, eat, sleep, and play here, and what real estate is like, then be sure to subscribe so that you can get notified every week I post new content. Now let's talk about the landscape. So Moscow just doesn't feel like it should fit into Idaho. It's not like northern Idaho. It's not like southern Idaho. It's different. It's its own thing. It's the Palouse. It's a beautiful landscape, rolling golden hills with all the farming that's going on up there, but just gorgeous. Very, very different. Now you compare that to Boise. It's more kind of high desert, drier. It's a little desolate once you get out of the Treasure Valley. But the Treasure Valley is great because we have the Boise River that cuts through town. They have done great irrigation. There's canals cutting everywhere, so water is just plentiful in the valley. They call it the city of trees, so there's trees everywhere. So even though technically, yes, we're in that kind of like high desert environment, it doesn't necessarily feel like it. In the valley, it's beautiful, it's green. And in Boise, you have a great view of kind of the foothills just north of the city. You have reservoirs really close by, and you have great outdoor activities, again, really, really close. In Moscow, it's beautiful in its own way, and you do have Moscow Mountain to the north a little bit. But in terms of water, there's not great water sources super close by. You definitely have to drive for them. It's not like there's a great river cutting through town with floating and fishing and things like that. So normally if you're out there, you're definitely going to head north up to some of the lakes as you move closer and closer to Coeur d'Alene. Now let's talk about airports. So if you're somebody who needs to travel, whether you want to be close to a good airport because you want to travel back to see family, maybe in your home state, or you need to be close to a good airport because of work. There are a lot of people that travel up to Idaho, move here, specifically Boise as well, who are still working in their home state, whatever that is, California. I know a lot of people where they have careers in firefighting, maybe they're police, maybe they're nurses. They have unique schedules and they don't want to quit or transfer. They want to finish out where they are, maybe because the pay is a whole lot better, or maybe they're close to ending their career and they just don't want to change things up at the end. There are a lot of people who will move to, say, Boise because it's got a better airport than Moscow. And so they can move here, get some good deals on flights, get some nice direct flights, and go down to, let's say, California for work and then come back. In Moscow, it's going to be a bit different. There's not airport specifically in Moscow. It's in between Moscow and Pullman. On the Pullman side, it's very small. And again, we're talking 1 to 2, maybe 3 employees in there if you catch a really early flight. I remember I flew out of Moscow one time and I missed the cutoff by a few minutes for checking a bag. And literally I didn't go on the flight because the gal who would check me in had stepped over because she also runs like security. And so she couldn't check my bag and she couldn't make it back over the line. Not that she couldn't make it. She's like, no, we're over here. We don't make it. And it was just funny because I'm like, oh man, small town problems in a small town airport. But again, typically a lot of people who are up in Moscow area, if they can't find a good flight out of Pullman, they're often just traveling all the way up about 90 minutes up to Spokane, Washington. That's going to be their larger kind of international airport. The nice thing about Boise, again, is that the airport is, 9 minutes from downtown, super, super close. So depending on where you live, you just have really good access to it. It's right off Interstate 84, and they're expanding it. So they're adding on a huge parking section to just increase their capacity for the demand that's coming to the Treasure Valley. Definitely a better airport in Boise. I know when me and my family moved, that was really important for us. I often find myself traveling, and so I really appreciate the convenience of having an airport close by. And if you're somebody like that, then that's definitely going to move Boise or the Treasure Valley as a whole higher up on your list. Now let's talk about weather. 2 cities, same state, very different weather. No surprise. Idaho is really big. Idaho stretches all the way up to Canada and then shoots all the way down, essentially to the bottom of Oregon. Utah, everything is below us, but we're stretching the whole height of all of Washington and all of Oregon. And so it's really diverse in what you get in terms of weather. On the east side, we're stretching all the way from the top of Montana, into a good chunk of Wyoming. And in Boise, in the Treasure Valley, you may have heard it been called like the Banana Belt. I remember when I lived in Montana for a while, I kind of lived in the Banana Belt section of Montana, essentially the section that didn't have as cold of winters. Granted, the winters were still really cold, but it wasn't as severe as the rest of the state. Boise and the Treasure Valley is like that. So whenever you think of Idaho, you almost just have to think about Boise and the Treasure Valley as its own thing because it's just so different than everything else. Case in point, if you're coming here and you're a little hesitant about winter and you're like, oh, can we do full winters? Or are we coming from an area that didn't really have winters? Then you're really going to want to think about this. But Moscow, you're going to get like a traditional Idaho winter. You're going to be shoveling snow in the winter. You're going to have berms in town of snow. It's just going to be a thing. Typically, you're just going to have it. So that means when you're driving, you're going to want something like an all-wheel drive vehicle. you're going to be thinking about that when you're planning trips. In the winter, if you're considering driving to Spokane, you're going to be considering that. If you're thinking about taking a flight out of Spokane, you're going to be considering that. The winter is definitely going to impact you in that way. Compare that to the Treasure Valley in Boise. Winters here are really, really mild. You don't necessarily need an all-wheel drive vehicle unless you're going out of the Treasure Valley, heading up to McCall. Maybe you live a little out of the valley, up into the foothills, so you'd probably want something then as well. Or if for work you kind of have to commute along 84 to other cities along this kind of corridor, then yes, you'd want it. But the Treasure Valley as a whole is pretty tame. This last year, I didn't shovel snow once. The sun would come up, it would melt what had dropped, it would heat up the concrete and the sidewalks. So it was very mild. You compare that to Pullman or Moscow, Idaho up north, and yeah, you're just shoveling snow. So it's just kind of a way of life. So the winters are very different. And if you're somebody who isn't that excited about winters, but you want to give it a shot, it's going to be a lot more milder in the Treasure Valley and more manageable for you. And you wouldn't be just throwing yourself into an extreme kind of northern winter. Now let's briefly touch on summers. So it gets hotter in Boise in the summer than it does in Moscow. And for me personally, I'm like, gosh, I'm not a huge fan of super hot summers. It's to the point to where, your car is just super hot when you go drive it. You're cranking AC all the time. You're kind of basing your outside activities more towards the evenings and the early mornings so that you're just not out in the solid heat that is happening. In Moscow, it's just going to be a lot milder in the summertime, so it's just not as bad, which in the summer when your kids are off and all that stuff, it's great. On the flip side of that, in Boise, you do have the river, so you do have some other ways to cool yourself off. In addition to that, me and my family, just this last week, we did Roaring Springs with the kids, which was super fun. And it's just a great water park. And then on top of that, depending on where you live, you could have a community pool. So we did a joint birthday with my oldest son who turned 10 and some of our friends. And they're in a community that has a community pool. And it was so great to just invite all our friends there. We all hung out and the kids swam for hours. And so obviously in any city, you're going to be able to find a way to cool off. But it is nice in the summer that Boise and the Treasure Valley does have a reservoir just outside of town that's great for boating, and then it's got a river that runs right through it. Now, that was some comparisons. I just want to talk about some similarities too. Yes, Idaho is a more conservative red state compared to other states. Boise and Moscow tend to lean more liberal in things. I have a friend who moved up to Post Falls, just near Coeur d'Alene, and a comment that he said is like, hey, I loved moving away from Moscow. It was just too liberal for me, which is funny because I think a lot of people when they're moving in, they're just thinking, oh, everything's super conservative. And yes, it is, but it's all on degrees. So there's that. In addition to that, people are really friendly here. So no matter which city you go to, I think you're going to get a really hospitable, kind, friendly atmosphere, maybe even more so in Moscow, just because it's, I think that just because it's a smaller town, I think people there are just more used to getting to know you, saying hi, and the community events there are really like the community events. All of Moscow has the farmers market. If you move here to the Treasure Valley, you're going to hit, farmers markets everywhere. You'll have the Boise farmer market and Cuna's farmer market and all these things. So things are still divided, even though you're in the Treasure Valley. Other things, you're going to get all 4 seasons. They're just going to look slightly different, but you're going to get beautiful falls, beautiful springs, great summers, great winters. You're going to have great activities in both cities. It just depends on how much you might need to drive to get to those activities in terms of winter activities or summer activities. Both cities are beautiful in their own way. The Palouse is just gorgeous, and Moscow is a great city to be in. It's very lovely and it's very different. And it will probably definitely be a change of pace and a change of view from what you're used to. If you're looking for a guide on your relocation to Idaho, please give me a call, shoot me a text, or drop me an email. I would love to chat with you and walk you through what the processes look like to make it really seamless. And if you're curious to know more about Moscow or Boise, then click on these videos above, which will go into more details on each.